For 15 years, my psycho ex tormented me, lied about a love child, and stalked my family. Then one DNA test finally ended her sick game. Hey Reddit, I've always wanted to share my story here, but little did I know it would take me 15 years to finally bring it to an end. So buckle up because this is a long one, but I promise it's worth it. Let me take you back to where it all began. 15 years ago, when I was 25. I thought I had life figured out. I was wrapping up a work contract, finally seeing the light at the end of a stressful few months. My relationship with Natalie, my girlfriend of 3 years, had been rocky for a while, but I told myself it was normal for relationships to go through phases. We weren't perfect, but I figured we'd drift apart naturally and move on without too much drama. That's how I thought relationships ended, at least back then. But Natalie was unpredictable. She had this way of turning small disagreements into giant emotional meltdowns. Over time, it became clear that the relationship wasn't just flawed, it was suffocating. She hated when I spent time with friends, especially without her. She'd get jealous if I so much as smiled at a waitress or said hello to a coworker. And the constant need for me to check in was exhausting. It was like she needed a full report of my whereabouts every hour of the day. It got to the point where I dreaded coming home. The last year we were together, I started to realize something important. I didn't miss her when I was away. In fact, the longer I was gone, the less I thought about her. It wasn't until I had a 2-month work assignment that it finally hit me. This relationship wasn't worth saving. The freedom I felt while I was away was something I couldn't ignore anymore. When I returned home, I was ready to end things for good. What I wasn't ready for was Natalie's big announcement. She showed up at my place one evening with this strange, almost smug energy. I was preparing myself for another dramatic argument, but instead, she dropped the news. I'm pregnant. It felt like time stopped. I didn't even know how to process what she was saying. My first reaction wasn't excitement or fear. It was confusion. The math didn't add up. She said she was 5 weeks along, but I'd been gone for 2 months. The timeline was impossible, and she had to know that. I asked her outright, "Are you sure about this? I think you need to do better at math." That's when she turned it on me. She said I was being cold and dismissive, that I should be celebrating the fact that we were going to have a baby. She tried to guilt me into believing her, but I wasn't buying it. I told her plainly, if this baby is mine, we're doing a paternity test. No test, no conversation. That's when the real drama started. Natalie refused the test and accused me of not trusting her. She said it was insulting, that I was just trying to find an excuse to leave her. She even went as far as to tell our mutual friends that I had abandoned her and our unborn child. Suddenly, I was the bad guy in her story. At first, I tried to explain the situation to people. I told them the math didn't work, that I wasn't the father, and that I was willing to step up if a paternity test proved otherwise. But Natalie was relentless. She made it seem like I was heartless for even questioning her. Some of our friends sided with her, saying things like, "Even if it's not yours, you should still help her out. She's struggling." That's when I realized I needed legal advice. I consulted a lawyer who made one thing very clear. Under no circumstances should I offer Natalie any financial support or emotional involvement unless I had proof that the child was mine. Anything I did could be used against me as an admission of responsibility. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it was the only way to protect myself. When I tried explaining this to our friends, most of them backed off. But one guy, let's call him Greg, just wouldn't let it go. He kept insisting that I should do the right thing and help Natalie even if there was no proof. I told him flat out, if you think she needs help so badly, why don't you step up and support her? That shut him up pretty quickly. The months passed, and Natalie gave birth to a baby girl she named Emma. She sent me a couple of photos along with messages like, "Emma wants to know where her daddy is." It was manipulative and exhausting. I stuck to my guns and repeated the same thing. No paternity test, no contact. Natalie refused every time. She said the test was unnecessary and demeaning. That's when things took a darker turn. Natalie started showing up unannounced, sometimes with Emma, sometimes alone. She'd beg me to see the baby, to be a part of her life. When I refused, she'd cry and shout, saying I was ruining Emma's future by abandoning her. I knew it wasn't true, but it still wore me down. I started to feel like I couldn't escape her. After months of this, I decided enough was enough. I filed for a restraining order. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the only way to protect myself. I walked into court that day with stacks of evidence, texts, emails, and even a few recorded voicemails where she begged, cried, and threatened me to be part of Emma's life. I thought the judge would take one look at all of it and grant me permanent protection. What I didn't know at the time was how limited restraining orders could actually be, at least in my state, and despite her theatrics, the evidence was clear. The judge granted me a 2-year restraining order, barring her from contacting me in any way or coming within 500 feet of my home. But Natalie didn't take no for an answer. For the first few months, she kept her distance, likely scared of violating the order. Then, just as I started to relax, she found ways to contact me indirectly, calling from unknown numbers, sending messages through mutual acquaintances, or even leaving letters on my doorstep. Each time, I reported her violations to the police, but the response was always lukewarm. They'd tell me to document everything and file a report, but nothing ever seemed to come of it. After the first restraining order expired, I learned another harsh lesson. Renewals weren't automatic. I had to go back to court and refile the paperwork, providing evidence that Natalie was still a threat to my safety. Each time, I had to relive everything: her manipulation, the stress, the constant fear that she'd show up at any moment. As the years went on, I started to build a life despite Natalie's interference. I met Kim, who was everything Natalie wasn't: kind, understanding, and supportive. When I first told Kim about my history with Natalie, I expected her to run for the hills. But instead, she listened, asked questions, and even offered to help me gather evidence for future restraining order renewals. I don't think I could have handled the next decade without her by my side. Kim and I got married a few years later, and not long after that, we welcomed our son, Henry. His arrival was a turning point for me. For so long, my life had been dominated by Natalie's drama, but holding Henry in my arms for the first time reminded me of what truly mattered. I wanted to protect him from the chaos that had followed me for so long. Little did I know, Natalie would find a way to drag him into it too. The first time Natalie tried to involve Henry was when he was about 3 years old. She showed up outside our house with Emma, holding a stuffed animal she claimed was a gift from his sister. I was furious. I called the police immediately, and thankfully they arrived before things could escalate. Kim and I had to explain to Henry why a stranger had come to the house, and it broke my heart to see the confusion on his little face. After that incident, I doubled down on my efforts to keep Natalie away. I installed security cameras, changed my phone number, and even moved to a new address at one point. But no matter what I did, she always found a way to worm her way back into my life. It was like she thrived on the chaos. Over the years, Emma grew older, and so did Natalie's tactics. She started using Emma as a tool to guilt me into contact. I'd get messages saying things like, "Emma wants to meet her dad before she turns 10. Don't you think she deserves that?" Or, "She asks about you every day. Do you really want her to grow up thinking you don't care?" It was always the same script, and it always ended with me replying, "Paternity test first." Natalie never agreed. She'd call the request insulting and accuse me of trying to humiliate her. I think deep down, she knew the truth. She knew Emma wasn't mine, and a test would shatter the narrative she'd built for herself. But instead of facing reality, she started dragging Emma deeper into her delusions. By the time Henry was 9, I thought I'd seen everything Natalie was capable of. I thought her harassment had hit its peak, but then came the zoo incident, a moment that made it painfully clear how far she was willing to go. By the time the zoo incident happened, life had settled into a rhythm. Kim and I had our hands full raising Henry, who was turning into a curious, bright 9-year-old. He loved school, animals, and anything related to dinosaurs. So when his class announced a field trip to the local zoo, he was over the moon. We signed the permission slip without a second thought. It was just another normal milestone in Henry's childhood. The idea that Natalie might somehow involve herself in it didn't even cross my mind. After all, Henry and Emma attended completely different schools, and I'd never disclosed any information about his school to Natalie. At least, that's what I thought. The day of the field trip, Kim and I went about our usual routine. I was at work when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick up. On the other end was Henry's school principal, and their tone was calm but serious, too calm, like they were trying not to alarm me. "There's been a situation at the zoo involving Henry. He's safe, but we need to discuss what happened," they said. My heart dropped. The principal assured me that Henry was okay, but the word "situation" rattled around in my brain like an echo. What could have happened on a school trip that warranted a call from the principal? I left work immediately. My thoughts raced. Was it an accident? Did he get lost? Did another kid hurt him? None of the possibilities I imagined came close to the reality I was about to face. When I arrived at the school, the principal led me into her office. Henry was there, sitting on a small chair, looking more confused than scared. A teacher from his class sat next to him, and the principal gestured for me to take a seat. Before I could ask what happened, the teacher spoke. During the trip, a teenage girl approached Henry and introduced herself as his sister. She said her name was Emma. It felt like the room tilted. I had to grip the armrest of my chair to steady myself. My first thought was, how the hell did Natalie pull this off? My second thought was pure anger. She wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was dragging my son into her delusions. The teacher continued. Apparently, Emma had walked up to Henry while his group was at the zoo's giraffe exhibit. She told him she was his sister and started asking him questions about our family. Henry thankfully knew better than to engage. Kim and I had taught him about stranger danger from an early age. He ran straight to the teacher, who immediately intervened and escorted Emma away. The principal chimed in, explaining that Emma had been accompanied by an adult woman who claimed to be her aunt. The woman said they just happened to be at the zoo and that Emma wanted to say hello to her brother. The staff didn't buy it, especially after Henry made it clear he didn't know who Emma was. Security was called, but by the time they arrived, Emma and the woman had already left. The principal looked at me with concern. Do you have any idea how they might have known Henry would be here? That was the million-dollar question. My mind raced as I tried to piece it together. How could Natalie have found out about Henry's field trip? The only explanation that made sense was that she'd somehow befriended another parent from Henry's school. Maybe she'd posed as someone interested in joining the PTA or casually struck up a conversation at drop-off. However she did it, she'd gained access to information she had no right to know. When we got home, I had to have a difficult conversation with Henry. I didn't want to scare him, but I also needed to explain what had happened in a way he could understand. Kim and I sat him down on the couch, and I started with, "You remember the girl at the zoo who said she was your sister?" He nodded, his small hands clutching a pillow. "She said her name was Emma. She seemed nice, but it felt weird, so I ran to Mrs. Bailey." I told him he'd done exactly the right thing. Then I explained as gently as I could that Emma wasn't his sister. I told him there were some people who might say things that weren't true and that it wasn't his fault if they did. Kim chimed in, reassuring him that we'd always protect him no matter what. He seemed to take it well, but for the rest of the evening, I sat down with Kim and tried to process what had just happened. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I'd already been through this cycle with Natalie so many times that I knew the steps by heart: document the incident, file a report, and start the process for another legal action. This time felt different. Natalie hadn't just harassed me, she targeted my son. That crossed a line I couldn't ignore. My lawyer agreed. He suggested we include the zoo incident in the restraining order application and push for stricter terms. He also brought up an idea I hadn't considered before, involving CPS. Natalie's behavior wasn't just harmful to me, it was potentially harmful to Emma as well. Using her own daughter to stalk and manipulate me was evidence of emotional abuse. It was time to take action not just to protect my family, but to protect Emma from her mother's toxicity. The idea of involving CPS made sense. Natalie's actions had escalated to the point where someone could have gotten hurt. If we didn't intervene, who knew what she'd try next? We also discussed the possibility of appointing a guardian ad litem for Emma. A guardian ad litem is a neutral third party assigned by the court to represent a child's best interest in legal proceedings. If the court approved our request, the guardian could advocate for Emma in ways that neither Natalie nor I could. Most importantly, the guardian could request a DNA test on Emma's behalf, bypassing Natalie's refusal. The DNA test was the key to everything. It was the proof I needed to shut down Natalie's narrative for good and to ensure that Henry and I would never have to deal with her manipulative tactics again. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and waiting. My lawyer helped me file a detailed police report outlining not just the zoo incident but the entire history of Natalie's harassment. The sheer amount of evidence was overwhelming. It was one thing to live through the harassment in real time. It was another to see it laid out on paper, spanning more than a decade. Once the reports were filed, the waiting game began. CPS launched an investigation into Natalie's home life, which included interviews with Emma, her teachers, and Natalie herself. I had no idea what the outcome would be, but the fact that they were taking the situation seriously was a small comfort. A few weeks later, we had the preliminary hearing for the new restraining order. Natalie was already there when we arrived, sitting at the defendant's table with a smug look on her face. She didn't seem the least bit worried, which only fueled my anger. After everything she'd done, she still thought she was untouchable. She is a real psycho. The restraining order was granted, just like all the times before, and I felt that familiar wave of temporary relief. But while the restraining order was a step forward, I knew it wasn't the full solution. The CPS investigation was still ongoing, and that was where the real change might come from. About a month after the zoo incident, I got a call from the caseworker assigned to Natalie's case. She wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the findings so far. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew that whatever she had to say would be important. During the meeting, the caseworker explained that their investigation had raised several red flags about Natalie's parenting. Emma's teachers had reported that she seemed withdrawn and anxious, often talking about finding her dad or asking why he didn't want to see her. The caseworker said this kind of behavior was a clear sign of emotional distress, likely caused by Natalie's manipulation. One detail that stood out to me was how much Emma believed Natalie's lies. According to the caseworker, Emma genuinely thought I was her father and that I had abandoned her. It broke my heart to hear that. Even though I knew I wasn't her dad, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for the confusion and pain Natalie had caused her. The caseworker also mentioned that CPS was considering recommending a guardian ad litem for Emma. If approved, the guardian would have the authority to request the DNA test that Natalie had been avoiding for years. As the CPS investigation progressed, the guardian ad litem request was approved a few weeks later. When I got the news, I could hardly believe it. The guardian would be responsible for making decisions in Emma's best interest, including whether or not to pursue a paternity test. The hearing to appoint the guardian was scheduled for the following month, and my lawyer assured me that we had a strong case. The day of the DNA test finally arrived. It felt surreal, like the culmination of over a decade of chaos and unresolved tension. I had spent years asking for this one simple thing, a test to prove what I already knew, and now it was finally happening. I arrived at the clinic early, nerves eating away at me despite my certainty about the outcome. Kim had offered to come for support, but I told her to stay with Henry. I stared at the posters on the wall, anything to distract myself. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept circling back to one question: how would Emma handle the truth? Natalie showed up late, dragging Emma behind her. Emma looked timid, clutching a backpack as if it were some kind of shield. It struck me that, in her own way, Emma was as much a victim of Natalie as I was. Natalie, of course, was putting on a performance. She huffed and puffed about how unnecessary the test was, loud enough for everyone in the waiting room to hear. When she caught my eye, she gave me a glare that could have frozen water. I ignored her, focusing instead on Emma. The process itself was simple, just a quick cheek swab for me and Emma. The techs were professional and didn't comment on the tension in the room. Natalie, however, couldn't resist a few parting words as we left the clinic. "I hope this proves what I've been saying all along," she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. I didn't bother responding. At that point, there was nothing left to say. Even though I was confident in the outcome, the stakes felt impossibly high. This wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about finally putting an end to the lies that had haunted me for years. I'll keep y'all updated once the DNA results come in. Because if I'm proven right, which I'm 100% sure I will be, Natalie is about to regret the day she was born. Update. Hey again, Reddit. As I promised, I'm here to keep you all updated. Well, the results came in, and let me tell you, they were exactly what I expected. Before I dive into the fallout, let me set the scene for how I got the news. The clinic called me directly, and I could barely keep my hands steady as I answered. Even though I was 99.9% sure about the outcome, the weight of 15 years of lies and manipulation had me on edge. The voice on the other end of the line was professional and straightforward. Based on the DNA analysis, there is a 0% probability that you are the biological father. I just sat there for a moment, letting it sink in. Relief doesn't even begin to describe what I felt. It was like this massive weight that had been pressing on me for years was suddenly gone. The nightmare was officially over, or at least the part where Natalie got to keep lying to everyone. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about proving I wasn't Emma's father. It was about holding Natalie accountable for the years of hell she'd put me through. And as satisfying as it was to hear those words, I knew the real work was just beginning. The court-appointed guardian ad litem arranged a meeting to share the results with Natalie and Emma. CPS wanted a representative there as well, given the impact the truth might have on Emma. I didn't want to be there, but the guardian insisted that my presence was necessary for Emma's understanding of the situation. Kim offered to come with me, but I declined again. I knew this was going to be messy, and I didn't want her to see it. The guardian began by explaining the purpose of the meeting, speaking directly to Emma. She explained that the DNA test had been completed, and that the results would clarify a lot of the confusion Emma might have been feeling. Then she read the results, aloud, telling her, "Based on the DNA analysis, there is a 0% probability that he is the biological father of Emma." For a moment, Emma just stared at the paper, her expression blank. Then she turned to Natalie and said something vague like, "Why did you lie to me?" her voice trembling. Natalie didn't have an answer. She started crying instead, mumbling something about how she thought it was true. It was clear she wasn't prepared for this moment, and it made me angrier than I'd expected. After all these years, after all the damage she'd caused, she didn't even have the decency to own up to her lies. I wanted to say something to Emma, to comfort her somehow, but I didn't know how to begin. Thankfully, the guardian stepped in, reassuring Emma that this wasn't her fault and that she hadn't done anything wrong. The CPS caseworker echoed those sentiments, promising that they would continue to support her as she navigated this new reality. The days following the meeting were quiet, but not in a good way. Natalie didn't contact me directly. She couldn't, thanks to the restraining order. But I heard through the guardian that she was struggling to come to terms with the DNA results. CPS had already flagged her home environment as unstable, and this revelation only added to their concerns. Emma, meanwhile, had started therapy, which the court mandated as part of the guardian's recommendations. She had been lied to her whole life, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. The DNA test results were a turning point, but they weren't the end. I wasn't about to let her walk away without consequences. After 15 years of harassment, false accusations, and dragging my family into her web of deceit, I wanted justice, not just for me, but for my son and Emma. My lawyer and I decided it was time to take things further. Enough was enough. First, we filed a criminal complaint for harassment and stalking. The repeated violations of restraining orders, the zoo incident, and her use of Emma to target my son made it clear that her behavior wasn't just toxic, it was illegal. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a long-standing pattern of harassment that had escalated over the years. Next, we pursued charges for defamation. Natalie had spent years dragging my name through the mud, telling anyone who would listen that I was a deadbeat father who refused to take responsibility. The DNA test completely dismantled her narrative, and we used her own social media posts and messages as evidence. Combined with the emotional and financial stress she'd caused me, the case was strong enough to demand restitution. Finally, we worked with CPS to escalate their case against her. The agency had already flagged her as an unfit parent due to the emotional harm she'd caused Emma. With the DNA results and testimonies from teachers, therapists, and the guardian ad litem, CPS moved to strip Natalie of custody entirely. The court hearings that followed were some of the most satisfying moments of my life. Natalie showed up to the first hearing without a lawyer, still clinging to the delusion that she could talk her way out of this. But this time, she wasn't just facing me. She was up against the full weight of the legal system. The harassment and stalking charges were first on the docket. My lawyer presented years of evidence, texts, emails, police reports, and testimony from witnesses. The court didn't just see her as a nuisance, they saw her as a genuine threat. Natalie was convicted of criminal harassment and stalking and sentenced to 8 months in jail with additional probation. She was also required to wear a GPS tracker during her probation to ensure she couldn't come near me, my family, or Emma. The defamation case came next. My lawyer highlighted the years of lies Natalie had spread about me, using her own social media posts and messages as evidence. The judge ordered her to pay $25,000 in damages for the harm she'd caused to my reputation and legal fees. While the money wasn't life-changing, it was a symbolic victory that sent a clear message. Her lies had consequences. Finally, the CPS case was addressed. The agency recommended that Natalie lose custody of Emma permanently. Her actions had caused significant emotional harm to her daughter, and the court agreed. Emma was officially placed in the care of her maternal aunt, who had stepped forward as a stable guardian. Natalie was granted supervised visitation only, pending completion of mandatory therapy and parenting classes. After the court rulings, Natalie's life fell apart. Between the jail sentence, fines, and legal fees, she was financially ruined. She lost her job shortly after her conviction, likely because of her criminal record. Mutual friends who had once defended her finally saw her for who she truly was, and she became a social pariah in our old circles. The mandatory therapy sessions didn't seem to do much good, at least not at first. Reports from CPS indicated that Natalie continued to blame everyone but herself for what had happened. But as time went on, the reality of her situation seemed to sink in. She stopped fighting for custody of Emma and eventually moved out of state, leaving behind the mess she had created. With Natalie out of our lives, my family was finally able to move forward. Kim and I focused on raising Henry, who was thriving in school and blissfully unaware of most of the chaos that had unfolded. We moved to a new neighborhood, giving ourselves a fresh start and putting physical distance between us and Natalie's toxic legacy. As for Emma, she seemed to be doing well under her aunt's care. I received occasional updates from the guardian ad litem, who told me that Emma was excelling in therapy and beginning to rebuild her sense of self. One day I received a letter from her. It was short but heartfelt. "I'm sorry for what my mom did. I didn't know the truth, but I'm glad I do now. I hope you and your family are happy. Thank you for telling me the truth, Emma." Reading those words brought a mix of emotions. I felt sadness for everything Emma had been through, but also relief that she was finally free from her mother's lies. Kim and I decided not to respond right away, wanting to give her the space she needed to heal, but knowing she was on a better path was more than enough for me. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much of my life Natalie consumed for 15 years. Her lies and manipulation overshadowed everything. But in the end, the truth won out. She lost her freedom, her credibility, and her ability to control those around her. For me, the most satisfying part wasn't just seeing her face the consequences. It was reclaiming my peace and knowing my family was safe. To anyone reading this who's dealing with someone toxic in their life, let me say this: keep fighting. The truth has a way of coming out, and when it does, it's worth every struggle along the way. Natalie thought she could get away with it forever, but in the end, her lies destroyed her. Justice was served, and I can finally say this nightmare is over. Before I wrap this up, I just want to say thank you to everyone who stuck around and followed this chaotic journey. I know I should have taken stronger action against Natalie years ago, and looking back, there were moments I wish I'd done things differently.